where truth and fiction collide. You're listening to John Christie. This is the intersection of Christianity and culture.
Well, I am your host, John Christie, and this is the John Christie Podcast. So today we're going to do something a little bit different. I am going to do some commentary. I'm going to engage or interact with a lecture. It's from the Great Collection series that's available on Amazon, and it's the series called Understanding the New Testament. And it's so far, I've gotten into it. It's interesting. It's not bad. It's definitely not History Channel level scholarship, and by that I mean biased, poor, not upfront. It's definitely has a critical scholar slant to it. The professor that's teaching this, his name is David Brackey. He has a PhD, and he is a professor of New Testament studies, and I believe he's on a board at Ohio State University. And he's a critical scholar, and I'm going to engage with that and talk about critical scholarship, critical thinking. But I wanted to engage with this because I feel like it's a good platform. It's a good lecture that opens up a lot of topics, and we're just going to focus on the episode 1. That's kind of the introduction to the course and the New Testament itself, because he brings up a lot of really good and interesting points and stuff that I feel, deserves a level of rebuttal. And by that I mean against critical scholarship. Sometimes I feel like it goes too far in what its intent and purpose is, and it needs to stay focused on what its real intent and purpose should be. But anyway, I won't go too much further into that. I think what I'll do is I'm going to play clips, and again, I'll pause and I'll engage with it, and we'll go through it. It's about a 30-minute lecture, so with my comments, I don't know, that'll probably make this podcast 4 hours. Not really. No, but, maybe we'll double the time or something. But I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's important because, again, what he's teaching is exactly what a lot of the thought that comes out of the college campus religious studies program. And again, I'm not saying that what he's teaching is wrong or bad. I just want to balance it because I feel that oftentimes what we get from the universities is imbalance in these teachings when they're done by, critical professors like Bart Ehrman and others. And it's become, more and more popular. So I think this is a good point to do that. So I'm going to go quiet for a little bit, let David do some talking, introduce the passages introduce the content, the course. And I'm going to chime in here and there and pause and we'll engage. I hope you enjoy it.
The New Testament presents a paradox. On the one hand, it's a single book, one of 2 distinct parts of the Christian Bible, and as such, it has provided foundational authority for Christian thought and practice for centuries all over the world. On the other hand, it's 27 different books, reflecting the diverse views of some 16 early Christians who lived in different times and places. That paradox has presented challenges to Christian thinkers from the very moment that the New Testament was born, but it offers wonderful opportunities as well. We can date the birth of the New Testament as we know it today to the year 367 AD. In the winter of that year, the Christian bishop of Alexandria in Egypt, Athanasius, wrote a letter to his churches in which he discussed, among other things, the contents of the Christian Bible.
Okay, so I want to pause there because I think what he's doing is good. He's introducing to you to when the New Testament was first codified as the New Testament. And what I mean by that was when it was first organized officially as the 27 books that it is that we have today, and that it was done under Athanasius, who, by the way, this again, he's going to 367 AD. Earlier in that century, 312, I believe, was the Council of Nicaea. Athanasius was the secretary at the Council of Nicaea. This is the Nicene Council under Emperor Constantine. This is where everybody says, or I should say, this is where many people misguidedly state that the New Testament was created, or that Constantine created the New Testament, or that this is when the men sat in a room and they all decided what books would be the New Testament. And none of that is true. It's far from the truth. In fact, the New Testament and the books of it had nothing to do with the Nicene Council. It has absolutely no bearing on it. It wasn't mentioned. It wasn't discussed. It wasn't brought up. The purpose of the Nicene Council primarily was to identify who the person and deity of Christ was. How do we deal with this understanding of the God-man, that the Trinity itself? And we know that because, number one, we have Athanasius's notes, his secretary notes from the council, and as well what came out of that was the Nicene Creed, which has nothing to do with the definition of the books of the council and everything to do with an understanding of who God is, the Trinity, and so on. So this is good, and I've got a lot to say as he goes on toward this, but I just want to start with that. I'm not opposed to his point at this part of the teaching, that's stating that the Bible as we know it, the New Testament Bible as we know it, was recognized officially by Athanasius to all the churches in 367 AD. There's more to say on that, but I'll leave it at that for the time being.
The bishop was concerned that some Christian teachers were using books in their instruction that should not be considered part of the Bible. Therefore, he decided to list precisely which books belong to what he called the canon, that is, the closed list of biblical books. Athanasius claimed that he had not invented his list. He was just passing on what he had learned from his predecessors. And yet he also described what he was doing as audacious. And in fact, it was somewhat audacious because, although he was not the first Christian to list the books of the New Testament, none before him had claimed to present a list that was definitive and closed. Athanasius did. In these books alone, he wrote, the teaching of piety is proclaimed. Let no one add to or subtract from them.
Okay. And that is true. That is definitely true. He's quoting from Athanasius when he makes that statement. However, there is a gap here. There is things that are left unsaid. And this is where I start to have the issues, because this is what often happens. Things go left unsaid. And so by what Professor Brackey is saying, it sounds as if before Athanasius made this list, there was a lot of different material out there, and it was all being used. And one could even deduce, because nothing has been said to this point, that it all had equal authority, that it was just a bunch of books, letters, material that was floating around that different Christians were using for teaching, and that it was all on the same level. And that's far from the truth. What does not get mentioned in here, and I'm going to mention these parts, I'll fill in the blanks, is that before Athanasius did this in 367, we can go all the way back to the early middle of the 2nd century, around 170 AD. And we have what's known as the Moratorian canon. And it's basically in a letter, in a correspondence, that there's a mention of 23 books of the 27 books that we now have in the New Testament. Or better to say, 23 of the 27 that Athanasius lists are listed in the Moratorian canon, about roughly 150 years before Athanasius did this. And it's done so in passing. It's done in a letter. It's not done with authority. It's not done from a bishop. It's not done from a church head. And there's very good reason for that. Number one, because that was not the intent of the correspondence that it was written in. Number two, because the church wasn't organized quite to that fashion at that time. There was an organization to the Christian church as early as the 1st century, but it wasn't quite what it became once Constantine legalized Christianity and made it so. That's when we start seeing the hierarchy come into place. And in doing so, in making it legal, it's now no longer, it moves from, the dark regions, hidden, meeting in caves or in houses quietly and hidden secretively, trying to avoid persecution, to now they can do this openly and publicly. And not only that, but it also has the backing of the government. So at this point, things are completely different. And that's why Athanasius felt like at this time, what I need to do is to make a letter. And what he does is he writes this in what's called the festal letters, which are letters that would be sent out to the churches from the archbishop or, the higher ups, for Easter or for whatever the festival was, right? It's a festival letter. And it would be information of encouragement. It could be doctrinal corrections or statements or something that they would say, church business to. And so that's when Athanasius does this, is he kind of lays out his church business. And in doing so, he says, here are the books that we now are going to move forward with recognizing as the 27 books of the New Testament. He does not say, and this has been pointed out by Professor Brackey, he does not say that I am handpicking these. He does not say that there was a council of people handpicking these. And this is one of the more important points. What he does is he recognizes that these are the authoritative books that for the last 300 so years have been recognized as authority, have been taught from the first disciples and apostles, and passed down generation to generation for 300 plus years to us today. While doing that, there is a recognition, although unsaid, of other documents out there. Documents like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary or other Gnostic Gospels or just other writings. Because without that authoritative seal of approval, anyone can say, I have a letter that Jesus wrote to me or whatever it may be. And if they do that, who are you to judge? Who are you to say that this wasn't from Jesus? And so the point is that these 27 books have a history of church use. They go back to the 1st century. We have quotes from them as early as Clement of Rome, quoting from the Gospels. We have Paul in his letters, quoting from the Gospels. We have many church fathers using them in their defense. Irenaeus, Justin Martyr. We have 300 years of a wealth of letters, correspondence, books written, arguments written against heresies and against other teachings. And by that, we have a reference to all 27 of these books, whether it's through a passage here and a passage there, and in some parts, teaching, commentary from them. There's so much written in the early church fathers within those first couple hundred years that you could almost reproduce the entirety of the New Testament without the New Testament based on their quotes. There's that much that is quoted from, that is taught from. So the point that I'm making and what is missing in this teaching is that these 27 books were recognized amongst the church and used amongst the church. They were circulated. They were taught from. They were held up as a standard. They were revered. They were copied, and copies of those copies were made, and they were dispersed. And all around the country, all around the Middle Eastern regions, Rome and Empire, these teachings were recognized as authoritative. And that comes to us, again, as early as 170 AD, when in the Muratorian canon, in a correspondence, these books are laid out. This is what is recognized. And it literally goes through pretty much naming each of them as we know them today. For example, Luke's gospel. So what is missing is the understanding that before Athanasius put pen to paper and made a list of made a list of books in his letter, these books were already recognized. So you could almost say by the time Athanasius did this, the church really could have responded with, well, no, duh. We know that. We're aware of that. But the reason it became important was because others were trying to insert their writings, their teachings, again, things like the Gospel of Thomas, which we have early church fathers refuting. All these other writings and teachings were coming in and trying to slip in, so he felt it necessary to codify it, to say, we need to say these were the authoritative writings. They were the earliest. They were done by the disciples of Christ, if not the disciples, the apostle of Christ, being Paul, and we need to consider this closed. We're 300 years, roughly 250 years or so removed from the events. We can't keep relying on other things coming in. We need to close this and say, this is what we have. This is what's being circulated. This is what's being used. Let's recognize this as scripture. And we can now close the canon or the list or the grouping, the library of what we consider New Testament scripture. Very important, because again, what that teaches us is that it wasn't created. It wasn't dictated as to what these books would be in the New Testament. It was more a reflection of what the early church was doing, what they were using, and what had already been recognized in other writings in one form or another, missing a book here or there. But primarily, again, at least 23 of the books get referenced pretty early on, so that when Athanasius does this, he really isn't surprising anyone. The going out on a limb that he was doing was considering it closed. That part was quite audacious, but yet, again, felt it was necessary because of the circumstances and being able to identify what is scripture and what is not scripture. Not necessarily heresy, could be a beneficial book, but isn't authoritative or as authoritative as these books. So let's continue.
Athanasius listed the books of the Old Testament and those of the New Testament. And his list of New Testament books, for the first time in Christian history, contained precisely the 27 books that constitute the New Testament that Christians use today.
Okay, and I just want to add it in again. The 27 books, but about 150 years before this was done, or closer, let's say, to 200 years before this was done, we had 23 of those 27 listed in the first Muratorian canon, which again was informal, but it shows evidence of what the church was recognizing as scripture. And then from there, in different versions of that listing, we have all 27 of these, but this is the first complete appearance of all 27 together in one writing. So I digress to that.
In the decades that followed, Christian leaders and councils in other areas ratified lists of the New Testament that were identical to that of Athanasius. In this sense, it's correct to say that the New Testament came into being in the year 367. But from another perspective, that's not correct. The idea of a New Testament, the idea that Christians should supplement the books of the Jewish Bible with scriptures of their own, That idea goes back to the late 100s, some 200 years before Athanasius' famous letter. And even more, the books that Athanasius included in his New Testament originated even earlier. Most of the works in the New Testament were written in the 1st century, before the year 100, and some as early as the 50s, more than 300 years before Athanasius' letter. And that's the paradox. The New Testament as a single book, as a finished and complete collection, came into being in the late 300s, at a specific place and time listed by a single man, Athanasius. But the individual books that make up that collection came into being at different places and times.
Okay, and again, just to add in, it's not that I have an issue with what David Brackey is saying. It's more I have an issue of what is not being said, which is he's not referencing the authority that those individual books had and how they were widely recognized as authoritative. They were not just equal levels with these other writings that were out there. That's the part in this that's going unsaid.
From the 50s of the 1st century to as late as the 120s. And they have multiple authors, probably around 16 different people. That can create some interpretive difficulties, as Athanasius himself clearly noticed. As I said, Athanasius made his list of biblical books because he was worried about Christian teachers whom he considered heretics. In his opinion, they were using the wrong books and teaching the wrong ideas. The bishop argued that true Christians teach only the truth that Christ taught. Jesus is the only true teacher of Christians, Athanasius maintained, for only he is the Son of God and knows all truth.
Okay. But again, what's not being said and what was kind of alluded to there was giving a little too much authority or credit to Athanasius. Because before Athanasius, again, we have many early church fathers. The disciples, when I say church fathers, the disciples had disciples. And those disciples of the original disciples, they had disciples. In every generation, it would continue on. And these are the early church fathers. So we have writings from some of the disciples of the Apostle John, or some that sat at the feet of Peter, and listened to his teachings, or traveled with him, was his secretary, was in ministry with him, was something. And this goes on. And as it's passed down generation to generation, these individual books, again, are taught from, are referenced, are used with authority to combat false teachings or other false documents or whatever it may be. That part is going unsaid here, and that's the part that needs clarification, is this wasn't an invention of Athanasius. This didn't start with Athanasius. However, in his position at the time as bishop, he was the one in the position to send out a notification to all churches that these would now be considered the 27 authoritative books. But what's missing is he did that based upon 200 years of history of recognition of these books, treatment of these books as scripture, as authority, again, referenced by early church fathers.
Naturally, Athanasius turned to his New Testament to find support for his argument. And there he ran into a problem. The writings of the New Testament seemed to contradict one another. On the one hand, Athanasius noted that in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus commands his followers, "Nor are you to be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah." That is, Christians should not have leaders called teachers. On the other hand, Paul, in his first letter to Timothy, calls himself teacher of the Gentiles in faith and truth. And in Ephesians, Paul says that God has made some people pastors and teachers. In his own letter, the Apostle James says, "Not many of you should become teachers." James may want few Christians to be teachers, but he does say that there are teachers among the Christians. How can Paul and James talk about teachers in the church, and Paul even call himself one, if Jesus said no one should be called a teacher? Athanasius wasn't certain that his solution to this problem was the correct one, but he offered it anyway. He said that Paul and James did not teach their own ideas. Rather, as good disciples, they only repeated what their teacher, Jesus, said. Therefore, even if Paul, James, and the other apostles seemed to be teaching, in fact, it was Jesus teaching through them. Even if some Christians are called teachers, they are really disciples. In this way, Athanasius sought to resolve the seeming contradiction between books within the New Testament.
Okay. And Athanasius is right. And bringing this up is, while I understand it's a point of mention because it is something that Athanasius drew attention to, it's simply understood you could consider that in most areas of scholarship. You have different levels of teaching authority. You have different levels of, from an actual professor to the teacher's assistant or an adjunct professor who may be working under the tenured professor, or whatever the situation may be. It's not that big of a deal. It's not quite a contradiction. The real key point to this is that the origination of the understanding of who Christ is, who God is, and basically what we have in the Bible comes from Christ, comes from the Messiah, comes from God. So you're not creating any new doctrine. You're not creating any new teaching. However, you are teaching or instructing on what has been laid down. And a passage that's not mentioned in this is in the Great Commission at the end of Jesus's tenure, his ministry here on earth, when he's now ascending to heaven. He gives instruction to his disciples to go among the nations and teach all these things that I have taught to you. So this is where, and we're going to get into critical thinking and critical scholarship later, but this is where it becomes really a splitting of hairs and it becomes very petty in order to label something as a contradiction when there really isn't a contradiction that exists.
Now, you may find this issue, should Christians who teach be called teachers, somewhat trivial, and perhaps Athanasius' evident concern about it is a little amusing. But when you read the New Testament carefully and thoughtfully, you'll come across other, more significant ways in which the individual writings differ from one another. For example, how does a person receive salvation? In his letters to the Galatians and the Romans, Paul stresses that a person is made righteous and thus worthy of salvation through faith in Christ alone, apart from the works of the law. The letter of James, on the other hand, insists that faith apart from works is barren. One must have faith and perform works. In a somewhat similar vein, in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says that he came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Anyone who relaxes the requirements of the law will be least in the kingdom of heaven.
So, these are the common, again, points to bring out of contradiction. I'm not going to spend much time with these because I don't really want this to become a teaching on that as much as, again, we're going to talk about critical thinking and critical scholarship and how the New Testament should be addressed. But enough to say this. Again, these things are not quite the contradictions that critical scholars like to lay them out to be, as if we can't rectify the relationship between faith and works. What is one to the other? This is something that Martin Luther struggled with, that other theologians throughout the years have struggled with, but I think becomes self-explanatory in the understanding of our relationship with Christ and with others. Very simply just to say this, and this is the point that James makes: if you claim to have faith but do not have works behind it, then how are you certain that you even have the faith and it's not just lip service? The one thing we know from Jesus is that when he forgave, he said, "Now go and sin no more." So Jesus required a level of works. Yes, we are saved by our faith. Absolutely. We are saved by faith alone and not the works that we do. but it's only the work of Christ and his atonement. However, if I claim to have faith and I live a life that's contrary to that, do I really have that faith in Christ, or is it just simply lip service? And let me use a simple analogy and we'll move on. I'm married. I've been married now for a few decades, and I claim to love my wife. However, if in my daily actions, in the way I treat her, in the way I behave outside of our marriage when I'm not with her, if I'm in adultery, if I'm living contradiction to what would appear to be love, then I think there's every right to question, do I really love her? And we see this repeatedly through the New Testament in Jesus' teachings of the questioning of, not all those who say to me, Lord, Lord, will inherit the kingdom of heaven. Because there's plenty of lip service going out there, and it's something we need to personally examine in our own lives. There's many people in the church that go to church because it's a cultural thing, not because they're there for Christ. I've said before, that there's many that come to the birthday party because they want the gift bag that goes with it, not because they want to celebrate the birthday party, not because they want to celebrate the person who's having the party. There's many that want to sit at the table of the banquet, not because they're there for the joy of the master, for the one who we're celebrating, but because they're there for the food, they're there for the drink, they're there for the activity. And that's what this calls into question. If you say you have faith, but you have no works behind it, are you sure you really are saved? I don't see a contradiction there. I understand where people claim there's a contradiction there, but I think if you're, again, wanting to hold it so wooden literal, so critical, then you will see a contradiction there, because you want everything to be precise and specific according to your expectation and your definition of what that should be. But let's move on.
Or, how should a Christian relate to the government? In Romans, Paul writes that God has appointed all the governing authorities, and Christians should submit to them. 1 Peter likewise tells Christians in the Roman Empire to honor the emperor. On the other hand, the book of Revelation condemns the Roman Empire as a demonically inspired beast. It calls cooperation with Rome fornication, illicit adultery with gods other than the God of Jesus Christ. Or, what roles should women play in Christian congregations? In his letter to the Romans, Paul commends Phoebe, who is a deacon in her church, and he greets Junia, whom he calls prominent among the apostles. But in Paul's first letter to Timothy, we find the commandment that women must be silent and subordinate and never teach or hold authority over a man.
Now, I'll say this because I don't want to dig in again to each of these examples that he's using specifically. We could have that in a podcast all of its own. But this is the enjoyment. This is the beauty of biblical studies, is digging into these types of things and recognizing the depth, the meaning. Again, not the contradictions, but the differences in perspectives, the differences in the situations, the differences in the language, in the human aspect that's brought into these writings, and wrestling with it and dealing with it and seeing that they operated in a certain time, in a certain place, within a certain culture, under certain circumstances. And as a result, that shaped the writing. And what we do, what we are supposed to do, is to extrapolate from that in a whole, the understanding and the meaning of the heart of God, not the precision behind each statement, and take it from how it applied 2,000 years ago and try to make that same exact application literally today. That's not the intention. But what we get from it is the heart, the understanding, the motive, the essence of it, and we bring that into our application today. Respecting authority? Absolutely. I still believe that God sets up all the kingdoms. He sets up the rulers. He's in complete sovereign control of who is the next president of the United States. And I may disagree with that person for policy reasons, but I should be respectful as a Christian because they are in the position that God has appointed. However, that doesn't mean it's a good representation of God's ways. They could be there for many different reasons, and they could be doing horrific things. But there's a level of respect that we give to our officials because we recognize them. And we'll move on. But that's the point to this is, so far, which is typical, when we bring up these points and try to make them scream as contradictions, what they're really just doing is just mumbling as differences. But I digress. We'll let this continue.
I could go on, but you see the problem. Or is it a problem? For Athanasius and for many Christians in the centuries that followed him, the diversity of views found in the 27 New Testament books was a problem that needed to be solved. We've seen how Athanasius solved one such problem. He interpreted some texts in a way that harmonized them with another. Other Christians have responded to the Bible's diversity in different ways. By interpreting its text to adhere to a single overarching rule, by interpreting the Bible's contradictions allegorically, by considering certain books central to Christian theology and others subordinate, and so on. These differing responses have come to define different movements in modern Christianity, as we'll see towards the end of this course. But a historian like me doesn't look at the diversity of the New Testament as a problem that needs to be solved. Instead, I see it as an exciting entry into the diverse ideas of the early Christian communities that gave us the writings of the New Testament.
Okay. So we're starting into a new section here, and as he said, he doesn't see them as problems that need to be solved. Where I think that's lacking is, and this is where we're getting into the critical scholarship. The Bible itself, to make it simple, just calling it the Bible as opposed to referencing it as the different books, it is not a historical book. It has historical events in it, and some are written from a historical perspective. It is not a scientific book, though it does talk about things that have scientific effect. It is not anything other than a theological book. While it has elements to it of poetry, of history, again, of different types of literature, what it ultimately is a theological book. And it has a specific purpose. And that's why these books were condensed, or consolidated, I should say, into one greater book, because of the recognized theological points, the statements, the teaching, the understanding, the theology behind it was more than just a recollection or an account of events. There's more driving behind it. What the authors were intending to do is more, as well as what the Holy Spirit is doing. We recognize it as more. As a result, if we only look at it as strictly literature, we quickly will miss the theological implications. On the flip side, if we only look at it as theology, then we run the risk of not understanding the theology of it. Meaning, what some people do is, it's strictly a theology book to them. It's something that God speaks to them with. And so they just open a page, go to a verse, and they read it. Based on that reading, they then make an interpretation. They do theology. But they haven't really taken the time to understand the context and, again, what it applied and what it meant to those who first heard it or who was writing it, and then apply that to what they know today. They just pick a verse out and they grab it because they like the sound of it, because whatever, God moved on them. There's dangers in that too. And there needs to be a balance between A critical mindset, meaning a mindset that reads it as literature, as a text, and another that reads it as scripture. There needs to be a balance between the two in order to get the proper interpretation.
Instead of homogenizing the New Testament writings into saying all the same thing, we can study each book on its own, let each author have his own voice, and try to reconstruct the beliefs and practices that each book reflects. When we approach the New Testament in this way, we set aside, at least temporarily, one aspect of the paradox. We no longer treat the New Testament as a single book, as Athanasius made it in 367. Instead, we journey back to the 1st and 2nd centuries, when there was no New Testament, but when the books that would make up the New Testament were coming into being. Now, some Christians fear that historians are seeking to discredit Christian faith through critical study of the New Testament, and certainly what we'll do in this course will trouble Christians who believe that the Bible must always be historically accurate in order to be spiritually true. In fact, however, most critical biblical scholars are themselves Christians. As historians, we are committed to following the historical method wherever it may lead us, apart from our personal faith commitments. And we believe that anyone of any faith can engage in and learn from critical study of the Bible.
Okay. And this is where I agree more than I disagree with critical scholarship. But in the areas that I disagree, it seems to be where it's the most prominent. And that's where critical scholars, I believe, make the largest errors. Now, when I say that, I may not be referring specifically to Professor Brackey, but more the Bart Ehrmans or the people on TikTok that like to do this type of critical scholarship. Because there's a game that goes on with critical scholarship, and the game is this. I hide behind the critical scholarship when it's appropriate, but then I become a theologian in order to make an accusation or tear down the authority of the Bible, of the scriptures. And this is what I mean by saying that. Very often critical scholars go by the word definitions, right? What it meant in the Hebrew, what it meant in the Greek, how this word is used. And they do this from a critical standpoint because all they're doing is investigating the text. They're just reading the words and they're just explaining or teaching what the meaning of that is. And then they take that meaning and it's distorted from what you may have believed this passage meant or Jesus was teaching. And so through this, they can say that Jesus was never claiming to be God, or that whatever it may be, they're then making a theological statement based on their critical scholarship. If they were doing true critical scholarship, they would only identify the data in the text and not bring an interpretation. But once you start bringing an interpretation, you leave critical and you become a theologian. And I've yet to hear any critical scholar that does not try to be a theologian, because it's natural. It needs to be. And I don't blame them for that. But what I do blame them for is either not recognizing it or not being willing to admit it, that that's what they are doing. And so when you try to argue the theological point with them, they revert to critical tools, right? Word meaning. Paul never used phrases like this. So we know that this, 1st and 2nd Timothy were not written by Paul because he never used those phrases if you look at his other letters. But what they're not accounting for is the intention of 1st and 2nd Timothy, who Paul is writing to and why he would be more intimate with Timothy than he would with the church at Corinth or the church at Galatia or the church in Rome that he never even visited. Why he would have different levels of words or the different scribes or secretaries that were writing for them, or the fact that you can say something in a few different ways over the course of different years, even decades, but the meaning of what you're saying is still the same. You've just adapted your language, the way you're speaking, because you've grown, you've evolved, you've changed, whatever the reason may be. They don't account for those variables because they have to interpret it wooden literally because they are critical. Only the data. However, when they claim only the data, and this is where I have a hard time, because when they claim only the data, what they're doing is being dishonest in then interpreting the data. Data in and of itself doesn't tell you anything. Data is just a representation of information. It does not draw conclusions. It doesn't tell you anything about itself. You have to go in and analyze the data and deduce a conclusion from that data. That is theology when it comes to biblical studies. And so what critical scholars do is they say, we're critical because we don't dabble with that theology. We don't consider when we look at the Bible that there's a Holy Spirit that's weaving these together. We see them as 20 separate individual books written at a specific time in history, and we don't look at that overall theme together. Yet then what they do is they make those theological distinctions, they make those theological interpretations, and they start using all the same tools that theologians use in their critical studies to interpret what their data has presented. And that's where I find the dishonesty, but let's move on.
But our goal is not to undermine Christian faith, but to understand its origins and appreciate its variations more fully. To look at the New Testament as a collection of individual works rather than a single book, we must first consider its contents and ask how we know them. That is, how do they survive for us to read them, and when and by whom were the individual books written? Let's look at these questions in a broad overview. The New Testament's 27 books come in several distinct genres or types of literature. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are called Gospels, referring to narratives of the ministry of Jesus that emphasize the final week of his life and his trial, death, and resurrection. Of these four, Luke is a special case because it's volume 1 of a 2-volume work, the second half of which is the Acts of the Apostles. Acts narrates the expansion of the Christian movement after the resurrection of Jesus. Together, Luke and Acts form a history of Christianity, from the birth of Jesus to the arrival of the Apostle Paul in Rome, probably some 50 or 60 years later. Most of the remaining books are epistles, that is, letters addressed from a Christian leader to a congregation or another Christian leader. A couple of these, like the so-called letter to the Hebrews, are not really letters. Hebrews appears to be a sermon, and the first letter of John is something like an essay or short theological treatise. Nonetheless, thanks especially to the Apostle Paul, the most famous New Testament letter writer of all, it became typical for Christians to call many works letters, even if they were not. The book of Revelation is an apocalypse, which means a revelation or disclosure from a divine figure to a human being. In this case, a revelation from Jesus Christ to a Christian named John. As in most apocalypses, Jesus' revelation consists mostly of highly symbolic visions. It's interesting to notice, however, that Revelation begins with a set of letters from the risen Jesus to 7 Christian congregations. In the New Testament, even Jesus writes letters after his resurrection. None of the original copies of these works survive. We don't have, for example, the manuscript of the letter to the Romans that Paul's secretary wrote as Paul dictated to him. Instead, these writings survive in nearly 6,000 manuscripts or manuscript fragments, the vast majority of which date to the 9th century or later. That is, what we have are copies of copies of copies and so on.
But what we also have, and the actual manuscript count, depending on where you try to go over 30,000 in fragments, some of them correct, but some of them in large parts and even whole books. But again, what's missing from this is what I had referenced earlier, the early church writings. So the manuscripts, the originals, we do not have, but we have copies of copies of copies. And the early church writings we have, which again, talk about these manuscripts, quote from them verbatim. And so when we compile that and we look at all the wealth of manuscripts, again, he's being narrow in saying 6,000 because he's limiting it to a certain period of time. But over the course of the first 400 years, having a wealth of manuscripts, again, over 30,000, and having the early church writings, what's so incredible about this is this is a great point because critical scholars attack this exact thing. We don't have the originals. So what's incredible about this is what we have is better than the originals. Because if we had the originals, there would be all sorts of arguments in critical scholarship over them being accurate originals, being forgeries or so on. There would be a whole nother wealth of arguments to try to discredit the originals. Plus, we would probably have an issue within the church of reverence over reverential treatment to those originals. You know, they would be treated, there would be problems as to who owns them, who holds them, who, and they would be treated as if they were God himself. But all that aside, what happened, the way this played out, is not like what the popular critical scholars will address. For example, Bart Ehrman, who's one of the most popular critical scholars of the New Testament, likes to pretend, because he's definitely smart enough to know that this is not how it was done. He's done enough studies. He likes to pretend that the way that the New Testament was written is that there was a letter written. Let's just take, for example, the Gospel of John. That the Gospel of John was written, that was handed to someone who transported it maybe 100 miles away, and then someone made a copy of that. Upon that copy being made, the original went back to John, and the copy went to someone else, maybe another 100 miles away. And they made a copy of that. And then the original copy went back to its original copyist, and that copy went on. And it's this linear, serial timeline of writing where you have an original and a copy is made of it, and a copy is made of that copy, and a copy is made of that copy, and it keeps going on. And what Bart Ehrman would say is that this is like the game telephone. And so when someone says something to the first person, and the first person whispers in the ear of the second, and the second to the third to the fourth to the fifth, then they say what was said originally. And it very rarely matches what was originally said. So with that line of thinking, Bart Ehrman would deduce that there's no way we can know, and in fact he makes this statement, as do many critical scholars routinely, that there's no way we could then know what the original said. So there's a couple problems with this. Significant problems with this. First off, in relating it to telephone is just inaccurate, wrong, and again, I'll use the word dishonest because I believe they're smarter to know that this is not how it was done. The objective of the game telephone, first of all, is to get it wrong. It's not fun when you get it right. So people even purposefully make attempts to change it. But that aside, this isn't the way it was copied. The way they were copied back then was more in line with a fashion like this. The letter of the Gospel of John was written. A scribe would stand in front, maybe more like a classroom setting, we'll say. There would be several scribes, and they would read it out loud. And as they read, they would write down. Now, enough to say this. We know how accurate the Old Testament manuscripts are, to the point where the number of letters on a page were known, what the center letter of that page was known, and that's how they would match it up. And when they copied, they were meticulous. And we know this because of things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, where we find copies of Isaiah and they're a dead match to what we have in our current Bibles. And those were done from other manuscripts that were never in relation to those in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that enough to say, when they thought they were copying authoritative teachings from the disciples and the apostle, that they took care in this. Many of these were former Jews that had converted to Christianity. This was a common practice of scribes. It wasn't something that they just took lax, that they just did casually. They had respect for the process. In some cases, it was their job. And they took great care and pride in their work. Enough to say that when the Gospel of John was copied, it was copied in multiples and at the same time. And I don't know if it was 5, 10, maybe 100. I don't know. But it was enough to say that they did it in multiples. Now, let's just use the number 10. John is copied now 10 times. You have 10 copies of the original. That's a first generation. So we have 10 of the first generation of John. Each of those gets sent out to 10 different areas. One goes to Rome. One goes to Syria. One goes to Egypt. One goes to Istanbul. One, they're sent all over. One sent to South Africa. One sent to Asia. One sent all over. When they get there, each of those 10 copies is now read aloud, and the process repeats. Each of those 10 copies is copied, let's say, 10 times. Once those are done, those are sent out to 10 different locations. And each of those are done 10 times. You've gone first, second, third, fourth generation, fifth generation. And we can tell generations at times because of the type of paper used, the writing style. There's many different ways that they're dated. Some of them we're able to date with carbon, but it's destructive, so not many. But enough to say that we can identify these generations. And so what we find when we look at these generations is that they match. They might have small discrepancies. There's grammatical things. One's called the movable mu, being the Greek letter. And it would be the equivalent of someone saying, have a nice day. And the scribe writes, have an nice day. Instead of a, they say an. Add the N to it. This makes no difference. It makes no change in the meaning, but yet a critical scholar would say that's an error. And so Bart Ehrman will claim that there's more than 400,000 errors, because what Bart likes to do is consider that movable mu, which we've identified as being the number one error that is found. And every time, if the first generation scribe, one of them did that, then the second generations did, the third, the fourth, the fifth, it's the same error repeated. That means that error was done 100,000 times. So this manuscript game that we play of there's no way we can know the originals is absolutely false. Again, what we have is a greater thing than the originals, and that's a wealth of many manuscripts written over different years in different places, copied from different copies, and they match. That's how we know the words are accurate. Some of them have mistakes, but we're not dealing with a 5-piece puzzle that's missing a piece and we can't make out the picture. We're dealing with 100,000-piece puzzles, and each one may be missing a few pieces here and there. But if we do all 100 of those puzzles, even though there's gaps, by looking at the other ones and comparing them, we definitely get the entire image, and we're certain what the image is. That's what we're dealing with with the manuscripts. Let's continue.
On the one hand, that makes the New Testament one of the best attested texts from the ancient world. On the other hand, all that copying means that all these manuscripts have errors and other differences. In fact, no manuscript of the New Testament is precisely like any other in its wording. They all differ in ways large and small. The number of such differences must be in the hundreds of thousands. Nearly all these differences are minor things that do not affect the meaning of the work, such as spelling errors or obviously accidental omissions of words. Some, however, are significant. That is, there are differences in wording that really do change the meaning of the text.
This is what they love to point at. Here we go.
For example, the surviving manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark give that gospel 3 different endings. We believe that the shortest of these 3 endings is the original one, but translations of the New Testament usually give all 3. Or consider the 8th chapter of the Gospel of John, where you'll find the story of Jesus defending a woman accused of adultery. "Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her," Jesus famously says. Our oldest manuscripts of the Gospel do not have this story, and most scholars agree that it was not part of John as it was originally written. But
Okay. I'm interrupting to say this. Again, what is not being said here, I'm going to fill in. Yes, there are those passages, and yes, our earliest manuscripts do not have them. The way we know that is when you look at those passages, they have a footnote to them, or it's an inserted note at the beginning of those chapters or that passage in brackets, and it says something to the effect of, earliest manuscripts do not contain this passage. In Mark, this ending. I believe there's 3 of them. There's Mark, the ending of Mark, which we do have in Matthew, and we do have elsewhere, but it looks like someone inserted it in Mark because they didn't feel it ended quite right. And so there's reasons we can get into that with timing of when Mark was written, Matthew, and so on, but it does look like it was added. The John passage, the woman caught in adultery, does appear to be added. Earliest manuscripts don't include it. And then I think there's another one, and I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but I believe there's a third. All this to say, what's referenced in those is also referenced elsewhere. The teaching of Jesus and the woman who's forgiven, we've seen that played out multiple times in Jesus' interaction with sinners. Go and sin no more, you're forgiven. I'm not here to condemn you, I'm here to forgive, repentant heart, all that. That's a typical theme. So it doesn't bother me that that passage is there. Maybe it was inserted. There's belief that it was a Gnostic story that got added in at some point. But either way, it's, again, inconsequential. If we took that out and never used that to teach, we don't lose anything. Nothing changes. We take out the ending of Mark, that's not that big of a deal. We have the ending of Matthew, and we have the Acts that references the resurrection, and Luke as well. John, it's not that critical. These things tend to be insignificant, yet we have to bring them up. And when it's brought up, it's not stated there's only 3 of these. It's stated as there are passages missing. There are things that we have that it says were never there. People inserted them. And it's all done to what they would claim to be critical, to be honest in dealing with the text. But the dishonesty is, again, you're not representing it as it is. You're representing it in the best way to make it appear in a negative. So let's go on.
In your copy of the New Testament may be set in brackets to indicate its dubious character. Discrepancies on this scale make clear that ancient and medieval scribes didn't just make mistakes or inadvertently omit or add words. They sometimes deliberately changed the text. They wanted.
Okay, see, and that's the conclusion. Discrepancies on this scale show us that scribes sometimes changed the text. Therefore, you have no idea what was originally written. You just know what people wanted you to know, what they changed it to. That's not an accurate statement. How many times, and this is what you got to ask when people make these claims, how many of these happen? There's over 100,000, over 400,000 errors. What are they? Have you seen them? Do you know them? Have you studied them? What are the passages that are bracketed? How many? He went over 2. I think there may be a third. That's not as big of a deal as he's making it sound. But this is what is done. And this is where I get irritated. And this is why I wanted to do this commentary, because these things get taught in universities, and they're taught in such a way because you're only being presented with the information they want you to have. And it's geared around planting doubt in your mind on the authority. I'm not saying you have to believe the Bible is the Word of God because the Bible claims to be the Word of God. I'm not saying the Bible is the Word of God because the Bible claims to be the Word of God. And I am more than happy to engage with critical studies. I do it myself. I'm a critical thinker. I read passages. I wrestle with them. Like I said, to me, that exposes the beauty of the humanity in those writings, as well as the cultural context, as well as the greater application that it had to those at the time. And I figure, how does that apply to us today? That's the beauty of growing in the understanding of God and his wisdom. What we don't do is we don't look to minimize a great story because of a precise use of a word that shouldn't be used that way. We do this all the time with the New Testament. We do not do it with almost anything else. In fact, critical scholarship is, you're not going to really find much of a program in any other discipline. In the New Testament or biblical studies, this is where it flourishes. In fact, if someone says to me they're a critical scholar, I can almost guarantee you that their field of study is the Bible. Because this is what's being attacked. This is what's going off. And from my spiritual side, I make no bones about it. I believe this is exactly the intent of not only Satan, but of man. This is ultimately the desire to question, as was done in the Garden of Eden. Did God really say? And whether it comes from Satan or it comes from humanity, it doesn't matter, because it's the same source. It's the source of, I will ascend. I will be like God, meaning I will make the decisions. That's what this really comes down to in most parts, right? When we're attacking and trying to discredit the Word of God, it really comes down to the fact that we don't like the authority that it's given, and we don't want it to have that authority over our life. It's autonomy, right? The governing of oneself. We don't like someone telling us what to do. We don't like someone telling us what is a sin. We don't like someone telling us we are wrong. This to thine own self be true. One of the most destructive statements ever written. Feeding ourselves, going after ourselves. And the way we do it is we make these attempts to discredit the authority of the Word of God. That's my spiritual side speaking, not my scholarly side. But my scholarly side proves abundantly that this is true. Because again, I see these arguments, I read these books, I read these critical scholars, I read the papers, I follow these things, I watch these teachings, I engage with this stuff. And what I find is very petty, minuscule arguments looking for any technicality that it can use to disprove a truth, or the book itself, which could disprove all of its truth. We understand that the little old lady who lived in a shoe whether or not she lived in an actual shoe and whether that's feasible and that's historically accurate and that's possible, and it makes no difference to us because we understand the meaning behind it. And if we're going to throw away that meaning because we don't understand whether she could actually live in a shoe with all her children and whose foot really fit in that shoe and how did it work, and it becomes insanity. When critical scholarship is taken to that level, I have a problem with it. And unfortunately, that's predominantly where it goes. Again, these critical thinkers that are so disciplined in analyzing the data only, or I should say in gathering the data. Sorry, they don't analyze it, remember, because they just gather it. They're just presenting to you what the data represents and making theological statements from that. And they don't even recognize the waywardness of themselves doing that. Let's move on.
Make it better, or they thought they knew what the author really meant. The number of differences among the manuscripts is so great that there are biblical scholars who devote their entire careers to what's called textual criticism. Textual criticism studies the manuscripts of ancient works and tries to date them and to relate them to one another. Can we tell which manuscript was copied from which? Some manuscripts have dates that say when they were copied, but others must be dated by studying the handwriting or the kind of paper used. Text critics seek to establish the original text, what the author himself actually wrote in the 1st or 2nd century. As I said, nearly all surviving manuscripts of the New Testament come from the Middle Ages. People are therefore naturally fascinated by the oldest manuscripts that we have. Many scholars would say that the oldest surviving manuscript of a New Testament text is a small fragment of the Gospel of John, chapter 18, called P52. It's a small fragment of papyrus, only 3.5 inches by 2.5 inches, and it contains only a few verses. It's just a piece of what surely was once a copy of the entire Gospel. Today, the tiny fragment is in the John Rylands Library in Manchester, England. It possibly comes from the middle of the 2nd century, in which case it would be the earliest copy of a New Testament book that we have. But it may also come from the early 3rd century.
Yeah, let me address something with this. First of all, there's a range. It's not possibly the earliest is the middle of the 1st century. There are some that say it possibly could come from the end of the 1st century. Middle of the 2nd century. Roughly, the dates given to it, I believe, fall anywhere between 90 AD and 150 AD. And there's several reasons behind this. I mean, it's very difficult to precisely date these, within a 10-year range. You usually have to give it somewhere in the ballpark of 40 to 60 years. So that becomes very difficult when you're trying to isolate. Now, the reason this becomes important to people is because people like Bart Ehrman, many others, critical scholars, love to make the statement that we have no 1st century manuscripts. And this is, again, the game of critical scholarship, is they like to establish these rules that they don't necessarily uphold with other writings, literature, books, but they like to make these claims and hold up these rules that the New Testament, primarily this is found with New Testament studies, but they like to make these rules that the New Testament has to abide by, as if these are hard rules that are set in stone that have been agreed upon by scholarly consensus, when they're really not. They're rules that are made up by a few. And then they get propagated and they become authoritative because, well, these must be the rules. And so one of these rules is we don't have a manuscript from the 1st century. We don't have any of these writings from the 1st century. Okay, here's the issue. Number one, I'm not so certain that that's as critical as we make it sound. But that fragment of John that critical scholars love to claim is from the middle of the 2nd century at the earliest. And if someone could prove it was from the 1st century, would that change everything? Would that all of a sudden make them believe the authority of it or anything? No, of course not. This is the game played. However, what you get there is words on a, roughly credit card size fragment. Now the words in the order they're in, and it's a couple lines that you see fragments of words in, you can clearly make out that this is a passage from John. What we have also that is not referenced in this game is, as I referenced earlier, we have the letters from Clement of Rome, who was a bishop in the church, who was quite possibly, because we don't know for certain, but most likely present during Jesus' ministry. We know he knew Peter and Paul because he makes reference to them, and he does it in such a way that we recognize he was at least under their authority, whether he actually sat and learned with them and discussed with them. He was at the time a younger man. But anyway, at the time of Clement writing this letter, he quotes from John regularly. He quotes from all the Gospels, Mark, Luke, Matthew. He quotes and he tells of, again, different scenarios, different stories. Our Lord said, now he doesn't say John 3:16 and then quote it. They didn't have the chapters and numbers at the time. We don't know that he specifically quoted from Matthew, the gospel that we have today. When he quotes from Matthew, he could have been quoting from what scholars believe was more of a sayings, a gathering, Matthew's first version before he wrote his complete gospel. Maybe there was this sayings, like these collection of teachings, but it's verbatim. We have the exact same words from John's Gospels, from Luke's Gospels, in Clement's letters, verbatim. And we know Clement wrote this in the first century. Scholars will agree on that. Critical scholars will agree Clement wrote this letter in the first century. But we don't have an original manuscript of John's Gospel from the first century. We don't even necessarily have Clement's original manuscript from the first century. But we do know in the first century, Clement was quoting from John. And we do know that the words match verbatim. Yet, we're being so literal, so wooden literal in our scholarship that we refuse to acknowledge that as evidence of first century Gospels. And so what we like to do with this, the reason why it's a game, is because what we like to do is then play this memory game, or I should say lack of memory game, where then what they'll do is they'll say, so since we don't have anything from that time, that means nothing was written. It's almost like they pretend nothing was taught, remembered, spoken. Because if Jesus died, let's just say in 35 AD, and the first writing that we have, the earliest manuscript, is 150, well, that's 115 years after Jesus. They couldn't possibly recollect accurately the same accounts. Those people weren't even alive anymore. And that's the game that they try to play with this, when the truth is you're basing that off of, again, the data that you have, and you're making this conclusion based off of the data that you have without doing justice to the analytics of the data, without properly analyzing it and saying, if we know Clement was writing and he quoted from these Gospels, there's no other writings we have with these words in them, and it's verbatim. It's clear that these Gospels were being circulated. And the way Clement does it, by the way, is not drawing attention for the first time to his readers. Those that he was writing this letter to were aware of what he was referencing. He didn't have to say, there are these writings, and in those writings, this statement is made like it's their first time hearing it. He's referencing it as the same way a pastor today will reference it to his congregation, with the exception of naming book, chapter, and verse, because they didn't have that. That was later added in for reference. So this is where I get irritated with the critical scholarship, because it pretends to be so honest and upright, and yet the amount of information that it leaves out screams at its inauthenticity. Or I should say, screams at its dishonesty. That's the proper word. And I've used that a couple times because that's the way I see it. It's dishonest scholarship when it holds the Bible to such a critical margin and yet refuses to read between the lines, because critical scholars don't do that. We don't interpret. We don't read between the lines and make assumptions. Yet what they do is make assumptions and create theological statements off of those assumptions. But that's not what they're supposed to do. It's a game. It's a game, and it's an annoying game. Let's go on.
Keep in mind that these early manuscripts were not copies of the entire New Testament. Again, Athanasius did not define the collection of 27 books until 367. Instead, they were copies of, say, a single gospel or of just the letters of Paul. In the first few centuries, the individual writings of the New Testament circulated independently or in small groups of letters, or maybe just some gospels. Only in the 4th century, during the time of Athanasius, do we get manuscripts that contain the entire New Testament. Let me give you a clearer idea of how scholars date the individual writings of the New Testament and how they decide who wrote them. Critical historians study early Christian writings, including those in the New Testament, just as they do any other sources from the ancient world. That means that we do not necessarily accept the traditional attribution of a text, and that we are open to the possibility that an author has composed his work in the name of another, more important person. In the case of the New Testament, this means that we do not start out by assuming that early Christian disciples named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels that bear their names in the manuscripts. In fact, the texts of the Gospels themselves do not claim the names of any particular person. For example, within the Gospel according to Matthew, the author never says that he's Matthew. Instead, the assignment of names to the Gospels took place in the middle of the 2nd century, as educated Christians tried to guess who might have written them.
Yeah. Okay, let me say this. There is no evidence whatsoever that educated Christians guessed at who wrote these. What we do have, and what he doesn't mention, is, again, writings from early church fathers that will reference the disciples in their writings. Now, again, they don't say in John's Gospel, chapter 7, verse 24. But they do mention John, and as John stated, or something to those extents, right? They're named. We know who these writers were. We maybe don't know specifically out of anybody's writings that Matthew is attributed to Matthew until we get to those canons. Now again, the Muratorian canon is middle of the 2nd century. And, for example, it mentions clearly and specifically Luke's gospel, and it says the 3rd gospel. So they were already in a priority. The order that we have them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, is the only order that we really know of from any references to them in the first couple hundred years. But nonetheless, they're named. All those letters, the Gospels, the book of Acts, they're named as early as the Muratorian canon. Again, roughly we'll say 150 AD, maybe 170, 180, somewhere. But that's a lot earlier than he's letting on. Now, in Eusebius's church history, writing, I believe, around 312, something like that, I think 312 was when Constantine legalized Christianity, and I think 327 maybe, or something in that ballpark. That range, the first, between 310 and 320, I got my dates mixed up, but was when Constantine legalized Christianity and had the Nicene Council, and now they want to know more. They want to understand, what is this that everybody's been working on for the last couple of years? What are these writings? What are these? And it starts to come together more formally now because, again, we're no longer hidden. We're no longer being chased and hunted. We're no longer being persecuted for our faith. We're now able to exercise it openly and publicly and write about it and talk about it and sing about it. And so everything becomes more formalized. And in that, Eusebius writes the history of the church. And in doing so, he's the one that really kind of lets us know. Again, he doesn't invent this. He lets us know that basically the common thinking, the understanding, the historical information behind these gospels was that Mark wrote it based on Peter's teachings. Matthew wrote his gospel himself. Luke wrote his gospel himself, but it was based on eyewitnesses, which he mentions in the beginning. And then John. They're named. It's not a mystery, and it's not invented at that time, and it's no shocking revelatory news. Eusebius is writing his history not to create the history for the first time to educate people, but because now that it's public, now that it's open, now that we're no longer persecuted, and we have the approval and the backing of the government, we now have a chance to make our mark, to write a history, to let people know what's been going on in secret and in hidden these years. And he does that. And he does it not only with the stories from the Gospels and the history of what happened when Jesus was on earth, but he does it with what occurred afterwards, even amongst some of this persecution. So this mystery of who wrote the Gospels really isn't much of a mystery. We know it because the more we read through the early church, we recognize that they only identified 4 people as ever being these gospel writers. Matthew, Mark, who was writing what Peter taught or said, Luke, and John. That's it. We never have somebody claiming that Matthew was written by a Harry. We never have anyone claiming that Luke was written by a John or John was written by a Tim. We don't have any of that. So if we're going to cast this doubt, we should have something behind it that helps represent that. All we have from history is the attribution of these 4 names to these 4 gospels and no others, period. You will not find another. In fact, they were considered so reverent that that's exactly why something like the Gospel of Thomas, which is written many years later, has no evidence of popping up anywhere, anyone teaching from it, arguing against it, until Irenaeus, who is in the later 2nd century, who makes some claims against the Gospel of Thomas. Doesn't call it the Gospel of Thomas, but references, again, passages. And in doing so, we get this understanding that others came onto the scene and started saying, we have a gospel too. Oh, look, we have a gospel also. Now you can start to understand why it became important to start to say, here's what the official gospels are. Not these other ones. These are their names. They're under the authority of Christ because they were disciples, direct disciples of him. They stood with him. They were eyewitnesses. And they gave us the gospel. Not these other spurious gospels. These other gospels that we don't know where they came from and who wrote them, and no one has ever heard of them or used them. They haven't been referenced. These others have been referenced from early on until today. Why didn't the original authors put their name on it? It's very simple. They weren't writing about themselves. They weren't writing for their own glory. They were writing an account of God come in the flesh. And they would not dare to impose themselves in that. So much to the point that John almost doesn't even want to reference his own name in his gospel, but calls himself the beloved. So, again, there's a lot of games that gets played with this, and that's where I get frustrated, because it's not what they're saying that is necessarily untrue, but it's what they're not saying, that they don't give the full picture. And when they don't give the full picture, they don't even allow you to make the conclusion. Again, scholars like Bart Ehrman make the conclusion for you based on that information, And it's wrong. It's not only wrong as being incorrect, but it's wrong as being deceiving. And that's why I have such an issue with these things. It's not, again, what they're telling you. It's what they're not telling you. That's most important. Let's go on.
Likewise, when a letter in the New Testament claims to have been written by the Apostle James, we historians will question that claim. James was known to have been the brother of Jesus, and thus he came from Nazareth in Galilee, and he is reported to have died during the Jewish War of 66 to 70. Does that fit the author of the letter of James? Could it have been written by a Galilean Jew before the Jewish War? Most historians have answered no to these questions, and so have concluded that it was not James, the brother of Jesus, who wrote the letter of James.
Yeah, the only thing I'm going to say to this is it's possible it wasn't. Okay, again, putting on my critical scholar hat, but the point I want to draw out is what he says. Most scholars, right? When people say, all scholars, most scholars, the consensus of scholars, I have an issue with that because there is no scholarly survey that goes out to everyone that teaches in biblical studies every year or every 10 years and asks these questions. And so what you end up getting is surveys from a conference, and let's say the conference was on critical scholarship of the book of James. And in there, they accepted all papers on critical scholarship on the authority of James and the authorship. And so all the speakers that are there are just going to speak about the authority of James and the authorship. And the majority of attendees that registered for this conference, that are professors that go to this conference, don't believe that James was the author, and they're there to gather information. And the ones that do believe James was the author are outnumbered. And so when they do a survey at this conference, and they ask how many of you believe that James was the author, and 85% say they do not believe James to be the author, then we say the consensus of scholars agrees that James is not the author. The consensus of what scholars? The scholars that were brought to the James is not the author conference? That's not a fair representation. I'm oversimplifying it, but that's the truth. That's the way these consensus works. What they don't do is they don't credit certain scholars. Like, for example, you can't credit a biblical professor at a theological seminary that is a full believer in the Bible, that's a Christian, that's a born-again Christian, and who fully supports the authority of James's authorship of the book of James, because he's not critical. So we can't consider him a credible scholar. So he's not part of the consensus. That's the game that gets played in this as well. In this whole, whenever anyone gives you the mention of all scholars agree, especially if they say all, he at least said most. But even when they say most scholars agree, and they say all scholars agree, or they say the scholarly consensus is, before they say anything else, that's where you should stop them and say, where do you get your data? Where does this come from? The best that they're going to pull up is, this was done at a conference held last March in, San Jose, California. Well, what was this conference about? Who were the academic scholars that were? Did every single biblical scholar in the United States attend this conference? Was it every single scholar in the world that attended this conference? Or are we talking a specific amount of scholars who gravitate towards a specific line of thinking? This is the games. I mean, this is where you get this in academic papers. You get it all over the place, right? The assumption that critical scholarship is above reproach, is above bias, is just absurd. And this is why I have issues, and this is why I wanted to talk to these points. We got about 10 minutes left of this lecture, so let's go on.
This example leads us to the primary point of reference in dating the texts of the New Testament, the Jewish War and the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem at the conclusion of that war in the year 70.
This is such a critical point. This is where, when I first started studying critical scholarship, it was one of the points that I was most disappointed with. One of the reasons we know Matthew, and I'm saying this sarcastically, one of the reasons we know Matthew is written after 70 AD is because he references the destruction of the temple. The Jewish temple was destroyed by the Romans when they laid siege to Jerusalem in 70 AD. Jerusalem ceased to exist after 70 AD. Israel as a nation ceased to exist after 70 AD. This cataclysmic event was the dynamic destruction of the Jewish people. Titus, the son of the emperor, and his soldiers barricaded in Jerusalem, burned it, starved the people out, destroyed the temple, laid waste to it. And the Jewish people were dispersed for until, 1947, 50, 58? I forget when it was, after World War II, and Israel became a nation again. From 70 AD till that point, the Jewish people didn't exist as a nation. That event is so significant. Now, they'll claim any reference to that had to have been after, based on the simple premise that we don't accept prophecy because prophecy would be divine intervention, and we don't accept divine intervention because we're critical scholars. So we don't see the spiritual. We don't believe any of that malarkey. We can't study whether they believe it personally or not. We can't study with that in mind. We can't study a spiritual theological book that has prophecy. We have to study a text with words in it. Fine. But you have no evidence that Matthew was written after that. The only evidence you have is because it makes reference to it. Therefore, it could not be. Here's the catch. Matthew references it. Mark references it. Luke references it. Even if we just dealt with Matthew, if that event had happened, I'm convinced with certainty that Matthew would have pointed that out. One of the main themes of Matthew's gospel is that Jesus is the Messiah and he has fulfilled all the prophecies. Jesus cannot trip over a rock in Matthew's gospel without Matthew saying, and he did this to fulfill the prophecy of Daniel. If Jesus picks up an apple and eats it, it says this was what was spoken of by the prophet Isaiah. It's throughout the gospel. If you read the gospel, it's everywhere. When Jesus talks about the destruction of the temple and he says to his disciples, you see this in all its glory? Not one stone will be left. Matthew says nothing. That's his perfect opportunity to say, Jesus predicted this and it happened. But Matthew doesn't say a word. This is one of the reasons why many scholars, biblical scholars, I'm using that sarcastically, but this is one of the reasons why people believe that all four of the Gospels were written before the destruction of the temple. In fact, there are those, and I am one of them, that leans toward it, but there are those that believe strongly that all of the New Testament was written before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. And the biggest reason why is because none of them reference it as a past event or a fulfillment of what Jesus spoke. One of the greatest cataclysmic events in human history, especially to the Jews, especially to those absorbed in this Christianity. If there's ever a statement made that you can point to and say, did you catch it? The Messiah said this would happen, and it happened. That was the event, the destruction in 70 AD. Not one of them addresses it that way. The book of Hebrews is unaware that the temple's ever destroyed because it in fact references going there and worshiping at that time. In fact, all the Gospels, They all reference, they speak of the temple, the city of Jerusalem, as if it still exists. It's still there. John even points out landmarks and speaks of them, that you can find them today at the time of his writing. So, to base a statement like discrediting James because, well, clearly the temple was still, or was already destroyed because it's made reference to, or Matthew because the same thing, that's not good scholarship, I'm sorry. But again, that's taking a wooden, literal interpretation of a piece of data based on a mere naturalistic fact that I've already discredited a certain level of thinking. This is what we call confirmation bias. I've already discredited a certain level of thinking, so I will not entertain anything from that area, right? I'm only going to entertain what fits in my model, which is that there is no prophecy. So if there is no prophecy, nothing can be prophetic. Anything referencing something that we know happened had to be in the past. Again, we're playing games at this point, but let's go on.
The Jewish War began when some Jews rebelled against Roman rule of Judea and Galilee. But it ended in catastrophe as the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem and destroyed the temple in it. The loss of the temple was hugely important for the religious lives of Jews, including those Jews who believed in Jesus, the people we call Christians. It had a huge impact on their beliefs and practices, and it cried out for theological explanation. Why would God have allowed such a thing to occur? We can date many New Testament writings based on whether they show signs of knowing that the Jewish war has happened and that the temple has been destroyed. The letters of Paul show no such signs, and so they surely come from before the late 60s. And in fact, Paul himself gives a brief outline of his career in the letter to the Galatians, and based on that, we can date his letters to the 50s, with the earliest, known as 1 Thessalonians, possibly coming from the late 40s.
Now again, this is in-depth scholarship. This is critical thinking. This is critical scholarship. This is what these people dedicate their lives to. And the number one point that they're bringing up, which, by the way, is one of the number one points to go against early dating, is the only way that it's possible that they reference the destruction of the temple is that it already happened, period. You need to ask questions when people make these statements. Why is that? And really, again, the simple answer is, well, because in critical scholarship, we refuse to accept anything of spiritual. So there is no prophecy. Prophecy doesn't exist. I would argue that that's evidence that prophecy does exist. That, again, within the writings there, what would be the motive that the authors would have? Why would they not want to scream from the rooftops that this amazing event occurred exactly the way Jesus said it would? They were constantly looking for reasons to defend or to prove that he was the Messiah. Why wouldn't they do that? And I think the simple answer is because they had no knowledge of it being destroyed. I'm not sure that they even understood what he was referring to. They were more scratching their heads in unawareness. But we'll continue.
On the other hand, the writers of the Gospels all indicate that they know about the Jewish war and the temple's destruction. The Gospel of Mark, for example, in chapter 13, has Jesus predict all the disastrous things that will lead up to the end of the world, the resurrection of the dead, and the last judgment. In the middle of Jesus' speech, the author adds, "Let the reader understand." That is, the author is saying to his readers, these things are happening now. Almost certainly a reference to the events of the Jewish war.
And that's what's called conjecture. He doesn't have a clear defense of that statement, so he does it by pulling a few things together to make that assumption. Let the reader understand is used more than just to express something as now. It's used to clarify a statement. It's not it's not always used in that way, and there's verses to see it and to prove it. It's not a significant statement, but yet again, if you're reading something and you've already made a determination that prophecy is not an option, therefore, how do we explain this in a naturalistic way, not a spiritual way? Then we have to come to these conclusions because we can't allow for the prophetic. Again, this is bias. This is not critical scholarship. Critical scholarship should have everything on the table and deal with it appropriately and equally, but they don't do that. They simply have made the determination that we rule out supernatural, we rule out spiritual, even though that's what the entire book is about. You do better to examine that, to investigate it. But it's kind of trying to recognize a color when you're colorblind. You're not seeing it because you cannot see it. You're not permitted to see it within your discipline, which again, if they were honest and true to holding that discipline, I would have more respect for it. But where I lose the respect is when the critical scholars then start making theological interpretations, statements. Now they've swayed from their rules of critical, let the data speak for itself, to now I'm interpreting it, and that's not what you're supposed to do. Again, I'm all for critical scholarship, but used in a reckless way is very dangerous, and I do see it used more recklessly than in temperament and control.
Earlier, in chapter 11, Mark tells how Jesus made a violent protest in the temple. Jesus overturned tables and chairs and prevented people from carrying things into the temple. Mark couples that event with a story in which Jesus curses a fig tree for being fruitless. The fig tree then withers away to its roots. Mark's point is implicit but clear. Mark indicates that Jesus' protest in the temple was like a curse on it, a curse that was fulfilled in the temple's withering away, that is, its destruction. So we can date Mark around the time of the Jewish war, that is, around the year 70.
Let's say this, that conclusion's never made. Okay? I do agree with that conclusion, but Mark never makes that statement. It's never shown looking backwards and calling attention to it and saying, did you see this? He cursed a fig tree, and that was the temple, and the temple withered away as the fig tree did. It was destroyed. He never draws that connection. It's more like the authors weren't quite aware what was going on with the fig tree. And in fact, they are puzzled in the Gospels about that fig tree statement. I do agree with Dr. Brackey that is the theological deduction of that statement, of that event. But Mark doesn't make that.
Likewise, the Gospel of Matthew contains unmistakable references to the fall of Jerusalem and the loss of the temple. And we can also tell that its author had read and used Mark. So we can date it to the later first century, perhaps to the 80s. The two-volume work, Luke Acts, and the Gospel of John can be placed in the decades following that. The book of Revelation can be fairly securely dated to the 90s, thanks to its references to emperors, persecutions, and other events in its context.
Now here's one problem with that. Paul quotes from Luke. He dated Paul's letters to earlier, and Paul quotes from Luke. If Paul's quoting from Luke and he says, as Scripture states, that means Luke must have been written before Paul quoted from it. So I won't get into the timeline because I could do a whole episode on this, but if you go to my website and you look up the Jesus, Lord or Legend debate I did with David Fitzgerald, and I go through this timeline, and a timeline I would represent when these writings were done. And I talk about these, and I talk about Paul quoting from Luke. I talk about Clement of Rome and his writings. It's on johnchristie.com. It's in the media section, and it's on YouTube. It was done at Sacramento City College. And it's called the Jesus Debate, I think, Lord or Legend. But anyway, you'll find it there. And I go through these points in there. And maybe, again, I can do it in another podcast or something, but we're running long, so I won't take the time now to do it.
With these writings set in their places, we can often date other works in relative comparison to the already dated ones. For example, the letters of John presuppose the Gospel of John and clearly come from the same Christian community, but from a different author within that community. That means we can date them most likely to the early 100s. This kind of relative dating applies as well to the letters of Paul. Based on the style and vocabulary of the Greek, as well as on their content, we can tell that some of the letters that claim to have been written by Paul are not in fact by him. The clearest examples are the 2 letters to Timothy and the letter to Titus, 3 works that are so similar to one another that we call them as a group the pastoral epistles.
And I'll address that briefly to say this. So the scholarly consensus, as they would say, which I don't agree with. And what I mean is I don't agree that it's the scholarly consensus, because they've eliminated many scholars that don't align with their reasoning. Anyway, the critical scholars would say that Paul didn't write 1st and 2nd Timothy, and he didn't write Titus, the pastoral letters. Why? Well, it becomes clear when you read them, and usually it's when you read them in the original Greek. We have to go to that level. You don't. You can read them in English, and you'll see the differences. But it becomes clear that the wording, the phrasing, the way Paul's talking or writing, it's not the same as it is in Galatians. It's not the same as it is in Romans. So clearly, Paul didn't write these. But, however, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are written similarly, so it is clear that whoever wrote those wrote all 3 of them. Now, Romans is written to a church that Paul has never been to. Galatians, Paul is heated, it's an argument, and he's hot under the collar about a few things, and he's got to set some things straight with that church. Whatever you want to take, right? These church letters are definitely going to be written different than pastoral letters or intimate letters to very close people. If I was writing a letter to my wife, or I was writing a letter to the congregation of the church that I go to, they're clearly going to be different. This is where critical scholarship, I believe, errors, in that it tries to set up a form, and if something doesn't fit in the form, it must be not of the same source, without giving freedom to the author having different forms. I act very differently in meetings that I'm in for work than I do when I'm having beers with my friends. I act very differently when I'm watching a football game. I act very differently when I'm watching the New England Patriots play football, or if I'm watching the Green Bay Packers and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers play. My response to the Patriots is going to be, I'm more invested. I'm a lifelong Patriots fan. I'm angry. I'm happy. I'm up and down. The Packers and the Buccaneers, I'll enjoy it. And I want to see a good game. And I may root a little bit for one or the other, but it's not going to ruin my day. This idea that an author must act the same exact way in every correspondence he writes is not only unscholarly, it's irrational. We're not dealing with computers here that have been programmed to operate a certain way. We're dealing with humans that wrote these letters, and they wrote them over different times, under different circumstances, in different moods, with different levels of education, because they grew and they understood things better, or didn't understand them quite well, or even changed their minds on things and had different feelings, and they were humans. It's absurd to think that the way someone writes should always be exactly the same. Now, that's even if they wrote the letters. Romans, we know Paul used a secretary because it's called out at the end of it. So Paul may be saying things and the secretary is writing them, and maybe it's not verbatim, but he's getting the words of Paul correct. And Paul obviously approved of it and reviewed it because he, at the end, gives his seal of approval on it. Maybe Paul used a word and it was like the scribe said, you know what? Maybe if you said it this way. And Paul said, oh, that's good. Yeah, let's say it that way. Would that make any difference? And now a scholar wants to say, well, Paul didn't write this because Paul never used that word. There's no room for any level of understanding. It's all done in a wooden, literal fashion. And so what we do is we assume if it doesn't fit our precise rules, and these authors never thought they were writing to be judged in this way, to be criticized in this way. Never was in their mind. Couldn't have been in their mind. It was 2,000 years ago. And now we're taking 21st century forensics and applying it to a crime scene 2,000 years ago. And it's absolutely absurd. It's absolutely absurd. And we do this in a game fashion. If 1st, 2nd Timothy go together and Titus go together by the same author, and they're in the same style, they're in the same genre, why isn't it that the same Paul wrote those that wrote Romans? Because he claims to be that Paul. And no one has ever challenged it until critical scholarship, until textual criticism had to appear and say, the word count is different than it is in others. Normally, Paul refers to him as Christ Jesus. Now he's saying Jesus Christ. Can't be the same person. That level of absurdity of scholarship just seems beyond petty, in my opinion. And again, when I look at the evidence that they support it, there's not much there. We're not flooding the data with all this abundance of evidence. It's very precise and picky things that they like to pick at in order to make these statements, which then the purpose of these statements is ultimately to discredit the authority, which then discredits the theology inside of it, which then means this isn't really a sin. Sin isn't really sin. We can do what we want. Did God really say? And that's where I say there's a spiritual game going on behind this. Let's continue.
These letters differ dramatically from genuine letters of Paul in their Greek vocabulary and the style of their sentences. In addition, it's clear that they reflect a level of church organization that goes far beyond what you see in Paul's letters from the 50s. While Paul's congregations were loosely organized without set offices, the pastoral epistles assume a paid clergy with named offices like bishop and deacon. In this respect, the pastoral epistles more closely resemble early Christian literature from the 110s and 120s, and that's when they were probably written. As you would expect, historians of early Christianity discuss and debate precisely when this or that New Testament writing should be dated and who might have written it. And there's more certainty about some texts, like the genuine letters of Paul and the Gospel of Mark, than there is about others, like the letters of James and Jude. But there's a broad consensus that the genuine letters of Paul come from around the 50s, that the Gospels date from about 70 to about 100 or 110, that Revelation comes from the 90s, and that the remaining writings can be distributed through the decades running from the 70s to the 120s.
Okay, so I want to address that. Again, he's making an assumption, and he's saying it because there's an absence, I guess, of a finely defined or spelled out authority, as Paul does in the letters to Timothy, where he talks about the qualifications of a deacon and so on. A pastor, teacher, apostle, the different things. Number one, we definitely see in Acts there was a hierarchy. Whether or not it was as mature as it was, 20, 30 years later by 50 AD, as it was in 35 AD after Jesus left. But instantly we see there's the 12, They've seen that they need helpers, deacons. We see that there's authority levels. We see that Paul and Barnabas, they go out, they come back, they report to the church in Jerusalem. We see a authority there, a hierarchy. We see in Galatians that Paul references that. And he talks about how he shared his message basically with the leadership in Jerusalem. We see in Romans that Paul calls out deacons. I mean, it's not true. Now they would say, well, but he doesn't specifically say pastors, teachers, these other things. But again, that's an argument from silence. He said enough things to know that there was church structure. Timothy is written at the end of Paul's life. They are some of his last letters. So by that time, which would have been 57, 58 AD, if Romans, let's just say, was written in 50 AD, that's 8 years that they had time to mature and develop these positions. It doesn't mean they have to go back to 110, 120, where we have other writings that refer to these offices. Because again, Clement of Rome was a bishop during the first century. We have these structures. You just have to be willing to see them and not be so, again, wooden literal in your interpretations.
As historians place each New Testament writing in its most likely historical context, they can understand better the diversity of perspectives that these writings contain. Each writing reflects the time at which it was written, and it responds to the specific community and context for which it was written. Let's return to Athanasius' problem with whether Christians could be called teachers. You'll recall that Athanasius noted that in Ephesians and James, we find Christians being called teachers and even calling themselves teachers. But in the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus commands that Christians should not be called teachers. Athanasius solved this by saying that although some disciples of Jesus do teach, what they teach is not their own ideas, but those of Jesus. Therefore, even if they are called teachers, they really are only disciples. Historians would explain this differently. We date Ephesians and James to the last decades of the first century. By this time, some Christian groups had developed specific roles and tasks, including the role of teacher. The author of James worries that too many people wanted to teach, and so he urges that people think carefully about taking on such a responsibility. The author of Ephesians lists the teachers among a set of Christian leadership roles, including apostles, prophets, evangelists, and pastors, all of whom should work to build up God's church. The Gospel of Matthew comes from probably around the same time as James and Ephesians. So why does it include Jesus saying Christians should not be called teachers? This passage occurs in chapter 23 of Matthew, in which Jesus criticizes Jewish leaders called Pharisees, and he forbids his followers to be called rabbi as well as teacher. Matthew, it turns out, comes from a Christian community that lived near and competed with Jewish synagogues that were developing their own leadership roles, just as the Christians were doing. The leaders of the Jewish synagogue were calling themselves rabbis and teachers. The author of Matthew wants to show how his community is different. His community, we learn elsewhere in the gospel, has apostles and prophets and other leaders, but he does not want them to have people called rabbis and teachers, so that they will stand apart from the local Jewish community with which they competed for followers. In other words, Ephesians, James, and Matthew all show that in the late 100s, early Christian communities were developing specific roles with titles. But different Christian communities developed these roles in different ways. Matthew did not want people calling themselves teachers, but that reflected his particular community and its experiences.
Okay, there's something missing here as well, and that is the audience. And that's going unsaid. Matthew's written predominantly to a Jewish audience. Think of it this way. Going with the traditional timeline, Mark's written first. Matthew then borrows from Mark to write his gospel, jogs his memory, whatever it may be, gathers his sayings, writes his gospel. Luke then decides it's his turn. He wants to write a gospel. And then John feels the need somehow to write a gospel. Why would that be? Well, I think Luke expresses it best. While others have made attempts to capture these events, I felt it necessary, or I felt it best, that I do so and gather some eyewitnesses. Each one of the Gospels has a different intent. Mark, being the first, was to capture what Peter had said, because we got to get this down. We got to get this in writing. This stuff is too good. We can't just keep telling this orally. And so he kind of did it quickly, and he abbreviated things. Maybe it was because that's all he remembered Peter saying. Maybe Peter abbreviated. Who knows? But it's the smallest and it's the quickest. Matthew clearly is written for a Jewish audience. Again, Matthew's intent is to prove Jesus as Messiah. Luke has almost no interest in that, but Luke does want to prove him as the Son of God. Luke does want to represent this as accurately as he can based on eyewitness testimony, which he says at the beginning of the gospel, and you definitely get that flavor throughout. Why does Matthew use rabbi? Because he's primarily talking to a Jewish audience. You can make assumptions on either way. Now, I'm doing the same thing that Professor Brackey's doing. I'm interpreting the text with a certain view. I have no problem with that. But when you claim, based on critical scholarship, that your interpretation is the only correct one because you're just looking at the data, that's dishonest. You're free to say, I believe that these labels of these positions came later. I would argue that yes, they did come later, but not as late as you're saying. Not 120. They came from 33 to 58, 59, 60, 65. Because when we look at these letters together as a whole, and we line up the dates, we see that progression. The argument isn't over the order and whether there's a progression. The argument is, what is your basis for believing that as a result, these have to move so far away and therefore couldn't be written by the original authors? And that's the part that's being left out. That's the part that what we've had as primary evidence is, well, because they had to be written after the destruction of the temple, or because the first time we see teachers being represented isn't until, early 2nd century, whatever it may be. Yet if I show it to you in this document, you say, right, but that document wasn't the primary source of it. It was taking that from, culturally another time or something. You start playing the game with shifting it rather than, again, taking it on face value, as Paul is clearly in his letters acknowledging a hierarchy, a leadership organization. In the letters that we know Paul wrote, we clearly see that repeatedly. And then in the letters that we question or don't believe Paul wrote, we also see it, but because we see it in finer detail, well, then it must have come 50, 60, 80 years later. What's the reason for believing that? Again, if we look at the church father writings, we'll see. And again, I keep going back to Clement, but because that was a 1st century letter, if we look at Clement's, there's clearly structure and organization. Now, if you're going to judge it because he didn't use a specific word, I think you're being petty. Again, I think you're holding it too wooden literal to the letter of the law, and you're trying to make it fit into a form that you created, and you're not willing to give any level of leeway to that form based on the author's intent, again, the audience or whatever the cause may be of that situation. However, you'll then take large leaps in interpretation that way when you make your conclusions. This is where I have the problem with the dishonesty I see in critical studies.
That's how the historical study of the New Testament works. When we situate each writing in its own time and context, we can better understand its distinct religious message. And we begin to appreciate the theological creativity and pastoral sensitivity of each New Testament author as he adapts the Christian gospel to the circumstances of his own community.
And he just said what I've been saying all along. When we take them in their individual historical, when we isolate them, separate them, and we judge them in a form that we make for each one, then we can do theological deduction from it. And that's just not the way that these things work. I'm sorry. That's not the way. If we're looking to excavate fossils and we want to carbon date them, that's one thing. But these documents aren't fossils that we're carbon dating to get their theological implications. These are documents that we have to understand the situation, the scenario, the author. We have to understand their intent, their purpose in writing it. And if we start with taking them on face value of what they say, and they have clues and hints in there on face value of when they were written, and if we start from there, and we appreciate, again, what the text is about, what's the reason for this letter? Every letter, every gospel, every book has a reason. And we interpret these things within that understanding, we can come to a different conclusion, and many do. Not all scholars agree with this line of thinking. And the fact of today is that universities now present this as the only way that you can study and examine these things. And the problem, again, as I've been saying all along, is they're dishonest in their approach and they're dishonest in their conclusions. By the mere fact that they restrict the study to a specific criteria that is based on naturalistic, formed methodology, but then they extrapolate theological deductions from it, contradicts itself. If we're going to treat this as a theology book, then we have to look at it from a theological perspective. If we want to interpret it as a history book, then we can look at it from a historical perspective. But I wouldn't expect data examined on its own to be able to reveal anything to us. It takes a person to analyze and make that decision. And I think that's where it goes off the rails. So,
when Athanasius collected 27 different writings into a single book called the New Testament, he set Christian theology on a new path, one that he evidently hoped would lead to unity of belief. Sometimes he and other Christian theologians had to wrestle with the diversity of those writings, which they could see as inconsistent with that unity. But for the historian, and perhaps even for the modern Christian believer, that diversity can be illuminating, offering a way to explore the beliefs, practices, conflicts, and struggles of the very first Christians, and thereby come to a deeper understanding of the Christian faith.
So that's about it. Again, I'm not opposed to critical scholarship. I enjoy it. I practice it. I just don't come to the same conclusions as easily and quickly as they do. And what I usually find is that they're coming to those conclusions based on conjecture. Yet they refuse to accept conjecture from others that come to greater theological conclusions or more traditional theological conclusions, but they're no different. They're basing their conclusions off of a lack of information, and they're making leaps where there's gaps. And yet they're becoming very cynical towards the fundamental or the traditional Christian scholars that don't make those leaps and resolve those issues, those differences, those timing deadlines through other means. And that's where I see it as a game. And this is what has become popular. This is what not only has it become popular in university, but it's become popular, again, on YouTube, on TikTok. You have critical scholars on TikTok now that love to express themselves as public scholars, only out there to represent data, not dogma, to represent truth, to represent facts, and only not interpret, but let it speak for itself. And I can't help the conclusions that are drawn, because these are clearly the conclusions. And all they're doing is their own theology under the disguise of critical scholarship. And that's where I have an issue with it. So I'm going to leave it at that for today. And thank you for listening. I'll be back again with more. And I think I'm going to do more of these commentaries. Take care.
Like what you hear? Hate what you hear? Have some thoughts you'd like to get off your chest? We want to hear from you. Contact us at johnchristie.com and be a guest.
Two broken down streetcars anchor with twine.